Sri Lanka's most powerful news brand.
A very good morning to you. You are watching Newsline. Today we have an interesting guest in the studio. Today is going to be, incidentally, the last show that we do for this year, the last show of Newsline for 2017. So we had to get an interesting person on the set in the studio to talk to you about what has been happening in our country and what is going to happen. Maybe a little bit of a forecast in terms of the politics and in terms of the situation in our country. We have Professor Rajiwa Wijesinghe in the studio. Good morning to you.
Morning, Joshua.
Professor, now for the past week we have been trying to focus on the government and to see whether 2017 has been a good year for this government or whether it has been a good year for the politicians and not so good for the people of the country. I have been asking this same question from all the guests that we had in the past week, and I'm going to ask you that question as well. If you are to rate the government, to say whether it was a good year for the government or a bad year for the government, what would your answer be?
Well, I would say it's been an absolute disaster, and this is for 3 or 4 counts, one of which is not the government's fault. I think weather conditions were pretty bad and upsetting. But, you know, we've had that in the past before. I think if you go over the last 20 years, there have been many disasters, and the country has recovered very quickly. But this time, you know, it's having long-lasting effects. I think you've probably seen the growth rates, which are plunging, inflation, which is escalating, and there just doesn't seem to be any sensible planning. You also have enormous reversals by the government at the drop of a hat.
Yes.
And meanwhile, the expenses of government are rising colossally. You know, one of the reasons I feel particularly bad because, you know, between 2005 and 2014, the country certainly developed in various ways. I think I still don't regret the decision I made to support Maithripala Sirisena in 2014 because, although I still have the greatest regard for Mahinda Rajapaksa, as Nala Gurhewal said yesterday, he was being surrounded by people who were really destroying the government. But the fact that none of the commitments of this present government were implemented, the fact that corruption has increased massively and blatantly, brazenly, the fact that economic management is a disaster. You know, recently I was talking to the World Bank and they were mentioned the way projects are messy, no one is looking after them. And there was high regard for P.B. Jayasundara, whom we all know was, you know, he was a bit of a political figure, but he was enormously able. He could keep his finger on all the buttons at all the time. He could supervise meetings. They were telling me this. And now a disaster. Take, you know, P.B. Jayasundara was the principal secretary to government at the time. Ranil Wickremesinghe appointed a man called Rafiq. He's a sweet old man, but really he was his secretary, the most important ministry in the country, which also had the central bank under it now. Rafiq retired, he was perfectly about 6 months ago. They still don't have a secretary. There's a rather sweet and ineffective young man who's acting secretary for 5 months. And you see, part of the problem is when you don't have a permanent secretary. I tried, when we were doing the reforms, to make the permanent secretary permanent. You know, when they had continued with this absurd provision that the permanent secretary be appointed by the president, I said, that's wrong. You promised an independent public service. And both Maithripala Sirisena and Ranil Wickremesinghe gave fatuous arguments. Maithripala Sirisena said, nah, you know, in Sinhala he said, you know, there were bad secretaries to the Ministry of Buddha Sasana instance. I said, that is because they were appointed this way. Ranil Wickremesinghe said, no, you can have exceptions. I said, of course you can have exceptions. He cited Anand Tisadi Alvis, whom you probably haven't even heard of. But he and I remember 1965. And of course you can have exceptions, but you must give a reason. So now you have a situation where the Ministry of Policy Development has an acting secretary, and this means that poor man can't obviously take tough decisions. So the place is run by Ranil's, you know, herd of geriatrics. Bhaskaralingam, Charitaratwata, all those old guys who really are past it. You know, Charita was a very capable young man, but the letters I'm getting from him now, I mean, he's bothering himself about asking that hairdressing There's an NVQ system which is English medium at diploma level, 5 and 6. Charita wants us to do hairdressing in Sinhala or Tamil because some people he knows have appealed to this. And I put it to the commission. It's my decision. Everyone thinks English medium is me. This was done in 2004 by a very distinguished man called Dr. Piyasiri, who explained, he was Director General, why they felt that it's in the interests of children to actually have access to the world. And here is Charita trying to turn back the clock. I mean, what is this about? He must grow up.
Professor Wijesinghe, now the people that you mentioned, you say that they are taking decisions. We know that there is the CCEM, Cabinet Committee on Economic Management, operating as well. Before we go there, now I want to ask you a question about the central bank. We mentioned the central bank, and we know that the central bank falls directly under the Prime Minister. The subject minister is the Prime Minister of our country. We saw yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, a paper article written by former Minister Ravi Karunanayake to say that the economic downfall of the country has been caused because of the corruption at the central bank, and that the central bank has incurred a 2.1 billion rupee loss during this year. And these are his words and not mine. A poor Prime Minister is not kept aware of what is going on. Now when you say, now this former Minister Ravi Karunanayake still may to some people look like a key figure in the UNP-led government. When a person like that makes a statement to say the Prime Minister is not aware of what's happening at the central bank, what do you think you can take of that?
Well, I think Ravi is also now joining the people who think the Prime Minister must go. And I don't really blame him, because obviously though there was massive corruption in his case in terms of accepting that, living in that flat, and obviously his relationship with Arjun Aloysius was disgusting. I still think that, as Rajiwa Wijesinghe has said to me when the bond scam first broke, he said, don't blame Ravi. I don't like Ravi, but Ravi is not behind it, it's higher up. And I'd rather suspect what happened is this was plotted. I was told by a very good friend of the Prime Minister that don't blame the Prime Minister, he was taken for a ride. Don't be silly, why did he defend Mahendra? Mahendra was taken for a ride. Apparently certain people, I think they were talking about Malik Samraka and so on, had gone to the Prime Minister and said, we have a debt of 1.5 billion. This is the best way of paying it off. And the Prime Minister, I would say he's stupid rather than poor, thought, well, I'll get 1.5 billion. He didn't realize if Arjun Aloysius is going to give him 1.5 billion. He would have made 10 billion, which he of course has dished out to everyone else to keep them happy. I think Ravi, realizing how they had almost got away with it, decided the following year to do the same. So this blatant bullying of the bank, the state banks not to bid, so that Aloysius could get another lot.
Or bid lower.
Disgraceful. So I think corruption, the central bank, Ravi is also responsible, but Ravi probably thinks I was only playing the Prime Minister's game. And now then I was sacked. And he's going away scot-free. But the second point is clearly there's total economic mismanagement. They keep saying nasty things about Nivad Cabral. I mean, under Cabral interest rates were low, growth was perfectly good, given that, don't forget, we also had bad weather in those days. We were doing very well, and there were plans. For instance, we knew that there was a debt. When Cabral left, there was a plan, he has explained all this, to actually make sure that the debt wasn't going to get impossible. What did these idiots do? They attacked the Chinese, the first thing. Now the Chinese, everyone knows that developmentally Chinese have actually been more constructive. A British friend of mine in Cambodia, for instance, told me the Westerners come and give capacity building, the Chinese build roads. In Ethiopia they said the same. And Ethiopia is now galloping ahead largely because of Chinese support for infrastructure. Now these guys kicked the Chinese in the teeth. Then they went to run begging to the Chinese when the Westerners whom they are running behind, the way Mangal has behaved in Geneva is quite disgusting. And when the Westerners basically said, no, I'm sorry, we have no money, they went running to the Chinese. And the Chinese, of course, are screwing them. You know what happened in Hambantota? Mahendra Rajapaksa would have got a much better deal. In fact, the sad thing is the Chinese offered a better deal. And they couldn't understand why these guys took the 99-year lease. So you have corruption compounded, and I have a feeling a lot of them are just making their money and taking it and running.
When it comes to this bond commission report, now we cannot forget that the report is coming out in a few days, and even though the people of this country are completely aware of what happened, now if the bond commission report comes out, the people will have a document to say, look, this is what has happened and it's in writing. So with all of that in mind, we know that the 10th of February is going to be once again a decisive day for the government and the opposition both, because the LG polls are coming up. With the Bond Commission, do you think it will have influence or an impact on the election to come?
Well, quite frankly, I have no idea, because you have got mixed signals. I think the fact that President Sirisena appointed the Bond Commission was a very good thing. I think the manner in which the Attorney General's Department, led by Dapal Dilivera and Jasantha Kotagoda, led evidence and pinned some of the crooks down was brilliant. But then you had this terrible disaster when they were actually obviously told not to ask any questions from Malik Samarakumar and Kabir Hashim, who, according to this friend of Ranil's, were, well, I think he didn't mention names, he told me he can't give me the names, were the people behind the whole plot. Right. And don't forget, they were the president and the secretary of the UNP, yes, chairman and secretary.
Chairman and secretary.
And obviously, you know, Malik had no business to be there. Senior, I mean, none of them had any business to be there. You don't have ministers going to the central bank and demanding money. So that was outrageous. But in effect, they were not questioned at all. And the Prime Minister, I mean, if you read his responses, I annotated them on Facebook, and then Colombo Telegraph took it up. I mean, his farrago of lies, and whenever there was an embarrassing question, he said, I am accountable to Parliament, I don't need to tell you. The usual obfuscation. I mean, the man is getting increasingly not only crooked, but stupid. And you know, I suppose the tragedy, and for me it's a tragedy of the Wickramasinghe family, which had a reputation for integrity and efficiency, is that this man, whom everyone thought when he came in was at least honest and at least efficient, has proved himself totally incompetent and totally dishonest.
We spoke about a situation where you mentioned a name and you said when Mahinda Rajapaksa was president of the country, he had people surrounding him that were not so correct in, you know, the principles, and that is why it led to the downfall of the Mahinda Rajapaksa regime. Do you think the president of the country is also surrounded by because you see, if any form of corruption is spoken about, you directly see that there is a UNP involvement. Am I right in putting it that way, or do you think otherwise?
Well, I think very clearly the UNP is massively corrupt. I think the jury is still out on President Sirisena. You know, he has a major problem in that he places cards very close to his chest. And sometimes you think even he doesn't know what he'll do next. Because, for instance, he appointed the Bond Commission, even having Indrajit Kumaraswamy instead of Charitra Ratwate, whom apparently Ranil was desperate for. You know, Ranil wanted to keep Mahendra, despite all the evidence. You know, his answers made it clear that Mahendra had obviously deceived him, and he knew this. But he would still want to keep Mahendra. So the president, I think, steps in occasionally. But I also think the president is in this state of panic about Mahinda Rajapaksa, which is stupid of him. You know, I am accused of having let down Mahinda Rajapaksa and joined Sirisena. I did so having told Mahinda Rajapaksa. I'm the only person who wrote to him beforehand. I also did not support Mahinda Rajapaksa against Sirisena in the next election. If you remember, I resigned, but I stayed on the government side until all the scandals broke and Ranil started telling lies. Then I crossed over. But when the election happened, as you all can testify, my whole argument was that the best possible government for Sri Lanka was a Maithripala Sirisena presidency with an SLFP-led government. And don't forget, Maithripala Sirisena is the man who gave Mahinda Rajapaksa nomination. And that was the right decision. But then he behaved badly. I've said this. He behaved badly, first by refusing to appear on platforms. So that handed over the campaign to people who didn't like him. I told Mahinda Rajapaksa, you know, your people upset him by saying that if you win the election, you will get rid of him. And Mahinda Rajapaksa said, Sri Nene, you know, that was said by some young people. You're talking about Prasad Neno. And I said, yes, but you forget that the minute they say this, the people around Maithripala way too, people like, you know, Faisal Mustafa and so on, ran to Maithripala and said, let us immediately take steps. So they got Maithripala to sack the secretaries. That was ridiculous, because whatever it is, Maithripala is the man who actually did something illegal and wrong to undermine the SLFP campaign of 2015. So the fact that they haven't reached agreement now, which is very sad, I still hope that they get together, is because Maithripala made it clear that, you know, you couldn't trust him to have the party agreement, because him sacking Susil Premjayat Priyadarshan replacing with Duminda Dissanayaka. Now Duminda is a case in point. He claims it's ignorance, but it's culpable ignorance. His agriculture ministry that cost billions. You know, any fool would say someone is making money. And Duminda claims, I don't know anything about it, I made a mistake. You know, in England he would have resigned by now. It's disgraceful, and he's made secretary of the party. And Vishwa Varnapala, another geriatric whose only claim to fame is that he, you know, falls at Chandrika's feet. He used to. He was made secretary of the UPFA. That was completely mad.
Professor, now we are getting a question from a viewer saying the good professor has done a study to establish the fact that Ranil lied in his affidavit to the Bond Commission. Why doesn't he publish it?
It's all published on Facebook. I sent it to the papers. They got a bit nervous. Ceylon, the Colombo Telegraph has published the whole thing. It's all there.
We have to go into a short commercial break there. When we come back, we are going to talk to you about the election that is coming up and how all of this will pan out in the coming year. Stay with us. You're watching Newsline. Welcome back. You're watching Newsline, and we are in discussion with Professor Rajiwa Wijesinghe. And we promised before we went into the break that we will be talking about the local government elections coming up in February in 2018. But before we go there, Professor, looks like you have been busy with this book that I have in front of me. Can you tell me a bit about this as well?
Yes, I actually, Godage published it last month and then launched it at a meeting at the OPA. And I presented the first copy to Lalit Veeratunga, who is someone I much admire in the education field. And the book is actually about, it's called Endgames and Excursions, and it's about how after I was not put into Parliament, I sort of assumed my shelf life was over, but then I've been working in other areas. But it also records my travels. And I would much appreciate if you showed some of the pictures there, the last, because, you know, even the Sri Lanka has been a disappointment. There is so much else to do in terms of both reading, writing, and so on. And I've actually tried very, very hard. If you can go to the pictures towards the end, just before the end, you get some fantastic scenery. And these are, that's Kotor, India, Kazakhstan, Ethiopia. And, you know, I really enjoyed the travels of the last few years. So that has in a sense been some sort of consolation for the mess in this country, because as I said, I feel some slight sense of responsibility. I didn't feel so in previous years when I was in Parliament and all, because obviously, you know, I did nothing. Well, no, I did a lot for Mahinda Rajapaksa in terms of in Geneva and the Peace Secretariat and human rights, but obviously, you know, he was a election winner on his own, and I'm not a vote getter. But with regard to 2015, I feel sometimes that perhaps I should have, you know, tried harder to get Maithripala Sirisena. I only saw him once or twice. I admired what I saw, to assert himself. Because, you know, everyone voted for him. I still remember when I told him, look, you broke your promise to make me a minister. And he said, Nane, Ranil and Chandrika decided all that. Go and ask them. I said, I'm certainly not going to ask them. You know, I will not go running to them, because I didn't work for them, I worked for you. And it's your responsibility. But I told him I'll accept it.
But now, Professor, when you take a look at things, with the election coming up, we've seen the President making several very strong statements. We even saw yesterday President Maithripala saying, quoting the Bhagavad Gita, saying that, you know, he mentioned the sword and he said, if you are corrupt, I will have to cut you down. Very strong statements by the President of the country. Elections coming up, the position the President has taken, how will that impact on maybe a possible reduction in the corruption?
Well, I certainly hope that the Bond Commission, A, doesn't go the mealy-mouthed way it was doing in the last few days with regard to Ranil and Malik and Kabir. And B, that the President takes action. But also what I don't understand is very much why we don't move practically the way that I suggested in 2015. All assets declarations should be made public. At the moment, you know, despite freedom of information, it's very difficult to assets. You saw how the Prime Minister dodged. People have asked for his assets declarations. It's not been handed over yet.
Yes.
I think the reason is not that he has too much money, because Ranil doesn't make money for himself. It's because he has too little, and people realize that his extravagant lifestyle is funded by the party. So his corruption is corruption for the party. But with regard to this, what I suggested is make them public, allow anyone to question them, And in the case of what is termed, the Thais call it, unexplicable gains or something, unusually wealthy, you tell them, look, you give the money back, amnesty. Because if you go the prosecution route, it takes ages and you never get anything back. So, you know, take one of, I think, the worst influences on Mahinda Rajapaksa. And that really influenced me strongly, you know, when Sajin Vaskunnathan hammered Krishnonis and Mahinda did nothing. I thought, you know, the president has lost it. If he cannot discipline someone who hammers one of his ambassadors, you know, it became public, something is wrong. Now, Sajin obviously hadn't declared his income, but he's fined 1,000 rupees. But surely what should happen is people should look into it. In fact, I believe that Sajin, who was, you know, obviously getting more and more wealthy, had to give up some of the places he bought, which suggests a greater honesty than Ravi Karunaka. You know, Ravi gets this flat free. Sajin was actually on a lease thing and then he didn't have the money to pay after that. So these are areas in which there are very simple ways of dealing with corruption. But the president is not, you know, he doesn't have good advisors and he doesn't even take the advice he gets. So I think it's a bit of a tragedy. I hope he moves quickly to asserting himself as the president. We elected him, we didn't elect Ranil, and we certainly didn't elect Chandrika.
When it comes to this whole situation of getting information pertaining to the bond scam, we see that it was because of the Presidential Commission that was appointed that we received all the information, and now we are able to talk about it and say this is what has happened. Now the president says a new committee will be appointed, a commission will be appointed for the Sri Lankan Airlines and the Mihin Lanka aviation service as well, and maybe a lot of things will come out because the country is suffering a 40.8 billion rupee loss because of Sri Lankan. So the president, while he has taken a few strong steps in the year that we are just moving out of, I want to focus your attention to the 2018 year as a whole. Now we see that the number of candidates have been increased. Once again I've been asking this question from all the guests that we had in the past week. The corruption is not going to end because there is no assurance in terms of how the corruption will be tackled. We see that an action plan is going to be put up by the government to say corruption and bribery will be stopped. Now all of this, when you take a look at it as a whole, what do you think? Our country, are we heading in the correct decision when we are moving on to a new year?
Not at all. Take these elections. You know, they've doubled the number of members. These are all rubbish. You know, when we were discussing electoral reform, and don't forget the president again let us down because he promised the SLFP that he would not dissolve parliament until electoral reform had gone through. And you had people who had studied electoral reform for a long time. You know, as you can see, Mahinda Deshapriya, a great guy. And frankly, he told me at one point, you know, it's Ranil who's blocking this. So then that was stopped. But the idea was a mixed system. Now, on the mixed system, what these guys have done, and it's criminal given the cost, is they've kept the number of members the same and then added PR numbers on top.
Yeah.
So you have like almost 100% increase. But what you should have done is halve the number of elected people and then top up through the list. So instead of, if say Colombo had 50 elected wards, you then make them 25.
Yes.
So then you have 25 elected people, and on PR you add another 25. So the numbers don't go up. In fact, you could have taken the opportunity to reduce them. Now that has been a mess. The provincial councils will be a mess because there is no commitment on the part of the decision makers to actually look for what is in the interest of the country. They're looking for what is in the interest of the politicians. They're looking for what will allow them to give maximum nomination because that's how they keep their supporters happy, including the crooks who finance them and the thugs who do their dirty work. But if you had a very clear vision, you cut the number of MPs, you ensure efficiency, you develop the act so that much more consultation. I still remember in 2012, local government minister Atauda called me in to discuss the new act, and there were provisions there for consultation, but they were consultation of people appointed by the Pradeshya Sabha. And I drew up a draft of whom you should have, so that these are representatives of independent institutions. For instance, the rural development societies, especially the women's rural development societies, the thrift societies. They should have representation selected by them. on all the consultative committees. But what you do, the act was earlier it had no consultation, appointed by the Pradesh Sabha.
Yeah.
So then you just appoint your people. I have also suggested in the paper I did for the Human Resources Development Council, which is not moving. You know, its chairman, who is quite able, turns out to just go Dinesh Veerakodi. He said he'll get the Prime Minister and the President to act. Neither of them is doing anything. That says that when anyone has discretion to appoint, and many people have discretion, ministers, presidents, they must give their reasons in writing. I am appointing X for the following reasons. They still have the discretion, but it is on paper why they have chosen.
Right.
Now they just put their thugs. You know, when they wanted me to get rid of the UGC chairman and I refused, Ranil said, no, you can appoint anyone you like, but they must know they got the appointment from this government, not from Mahinda. That is not the point. You don't want to appoint people who are grateful to you. You want to appoint people who will do a job.
Yes.
And that is not happening because no one even understands amongst the politicians that government is not about making sure you're re-elected.
Yeah.
That's all they're concerned about.
With that, we are drawing close to our conclusion of the last program of this year. We also have to keep in mind with what Professor Wijesinghe has said, it's not about electing or putting people so that you're making yourself sure that you will be re-elected. But it is a situation where you have to make sure that the people you appoint do their job properly, and we have not seen that from the appointments that have been made by the Prime Minister. We've seen a failure at the central bank where the bond scam happened. We've seen how the Sri Lankan Airlines is operating with a brother of a member of the CCEM. We've seen a lot of things happening in the past year. Now, because this is our last program, I want to maybe leave you all with an idea that I want to ask this from Professor as well. Now we see that there are two forces within when it comes to this election. We see the UNP on one side, Ranil Wickremesinghe led UNP, and we see the Podujana party or the other parties that are coming together led by former President Mahinda Rajapaksa. There seems to be an arrangement between the two, and we saw that when President Mahinda Rajapaksa was elected out, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe personally going to the temple trees and talking to him and arranging a smooth transition, if I may put it that way. So that situation has put the President also in the limelight. As you said, the President is in one hand worried about Mahinda Rajapaksa as well, and you did not agree with that. But with all of this happening, President on one corner, Mahinda Rajapaksa, Ranil Wickremesinghe on the other, trying to attack the President. Things of this nature going on, the executive presidency, I don't know whether it's respected properly, but with all of that, let's leave that aside. The people of this country, who's going to take care of us?
Well, at the moment, I don't think anyone cares. I think there's a possibility that the President takes a deep breath and says, I'm going to do what's best for the country, I'm going to have a new Prime Minister. I think Mahinda Rajapaksa's group should accept that that new Prime Minister should come from the UNP, and there are plenty of good candidates. There's also a bad candidate who might keep everyone happy, Tilak Marapana, because then Ranil can't complain, it's his guy, Tilak has no allegiance except to him. But there's Talatata Korala, there's Ranjit Madhuma Bandara, there are a lot of people who are not tainted by Ranil. Sarjit and Karu, I think, sadly have played themselves out, which is a pity. And then if Mahinda Rajapaksa's group says, okay, let us have a Prime Minister who is honest and who will work, and for 18 months more, we will give you support from outside.
Maybe former President Mahinda Rajapaksa has to also understand that the President is now the President, and that the SLFP is under him, and maybe they should also decide to not be a separate party like the Joint Opposition or the Podujana Peramuna and come back and join them.
But I think that was what happened in 2015. It was the President who sacked the secretaries and didn't appear on platforms. He handed things over on a platter to the people who didn't like him. So I think that was a mistake on his part. But you're right, the President was elected by the people. That needs to be respected. I still remember, when they wanted a motion of no confidence in Ranil, and the foreigners also weighed in and bullied the President to dissolving Parliament because they wanted Ranil. But I told Vasudeva, why don't you tell the President, look, we want a vote of no confidence, but you appoint someone you like. And Vasudeva told me, Lester, you were right, but we thought we had the majority, so it should be our person. And idiot hadn't realized that on a presidential system, the president can dissolve parliament whenever he wants. You know, as I've always said, there's no one like the old left who have the greatest respect for the Westminster system and don't understand that the Westminster system isn't what operates here. So by bullying and saying they want Dinesh or somebody as Prime Minister, obviously the President panicked. So you have to realize that as President, he should appoint a Prime Minister he wants, but you have to insist that it is a Prime Minister whose sole purpose is destroying everyone else in order to project himself. So it should be someone perhaps with no great political ambitions, but a willingness to work together with other people. I think Marappa can do it. I mean, I was quite impressed by the fact that he dissociated himself from Ranil and Mangala and, you know, the foreign ministry people who are attacking Lord Naseby in the interest of the West.
Yeah.
I think Marappan has shown that he does not necessarily follow the Ranil Wickremesinghe line, even despite his personal loyalty. Someone like that should be acceptable to everybody except Ranil and Mangala.
Thank you, Professor Wijesinghe, for being here with us this morning and talking to us about the year and talking to us about the year 2018 as well. And I hope the new year will bring you a lot of good things, and I hope the new year will bring our viewers a lot of good things as well. Now, we also know that the government is two parties, the UNP and the SLFP, but if you take a look at every corruption that has happened during this year, we know that the finger was pointed towards the UNP. We know that the former president's government was elected out because it was accused of allegations of being corrupt. Court case is ongoing, various allegations were made. People appointed this new government in a hope that it will all go away, but what has happened is up to you to decide. Whether this is what you wanted is up to you to decide sitting at home. 2017 has been this, and what will 2018 be is up to you once again to decide. Are we going to follow this same trend and go into another year and let everything go back to the way it was, or are we going to make some form of change when we have that authority, when we have that power? On the 10th of February 2018 is up to you to decide. Thank you very much for being a loyal viewer of Newsline throughout 2017. From Monday, Farah Shaukat Ali, the original host of this program, will be back, and he will have interesting guests lined up for you throughout the year. So thank you very much for being with us, and thank you very much for encouraging us and supporting us through the text messages that you send. I've been Saturang Hapuarachi. Take care.